Lipman Brown is a former state senator from Nevada, so at one point she was in the position of being lobbied. Now she's in the position of doing the lobbying. The Secular Coalition for America is composed of 8 national free thought groups like American Atheists, Atheist Alliance International, no, not American Atheists, you're right.
Yeah.
Atheist Alliance International, American Humanist Association, Military Association of Atheists and Freethinkers, etc. And she was the first paid lobbyist on behalf of atheists, humanists, and freethinkers in Washington, D.C. Just this past January, I and Joe Foley, who's also a member of Minnesota Atheists, happened to be in Washington for an atheist meeting. And she arranged meetings for us with the staff of Senators Klobuchar and Coleman and Representatives Keith Ellison and Betty McCollum. And we saw all of them, or at least their staff members, in one day. So that's the kind of thing, if you're ever going to Washington, she can set up meetings with your representatives. As Steve mentioned, there's a green schedule for other appearances. And finally, we're hoping that in her many visits here during this week, many appearances, we can get 50 people to sign up to pledge $10 a month so that they know that they have $500 a month coming from Minnesota to help staff their great efforts. But with that, I'd like to welcome Lipman Brown.
Thank you. Thanks, August. I'm going to start with a true story. Last year, I was sitting in a Judiciary Committee hearing, and a representative by the name of Louis Gohmert from a congressional district in Texas proposed an amendment to a federal prison training program bill that would have allowed religious discrimination in hiring the trainers. At this point, Representative Anthony Weiner from New York asked Representative Gohmert, if someone is just teaching typing to a prisoner, what difference, with federal dollars, what difference does it make what religion the trainer is? And Representative Gohmert explained, even if I'm hiring a janitor, I already know who the best workers are going to be, because even if someone is just mopping floors, if that person attends my church, I know they're mopping those floors for the glory of God, and I know they're the better candidate for the job. So, this is the kind of situation that existed for quite some time in Congress. Luckily, that particular amendment didn't go through, and obviously, if you're using federal dollars for federal training programs, you still can't discriminate against someone for a job based solely on their religion. But there's a huge difference between last year and this year. The Secular Coalition for America lobbies bipartisanly, and we don't endorse any candidates. And as August knows, we visit with Senator Coleman and other folks on both sides of the aisle. But the difference that last November's election made was a difference in leadership and a difference in majorities in every committee. This has changed the focus of Congress so that the focus is no longer constantly on attacking us, but rather moving forward with important matters. Let me give you the best example I have of this change. For a number of years now, over and over again, the House has passed an amendment to the federal Head Start bill that says you can do exactly what Representative Gohmert wanted to do with prison training. That is, completely federally funded, secular program for at-risk children to learn how to read and do math. That you could discriminate based on a prospective employee's religion as to whether or not they got a job being a Head Start teacher. And for years now, the House kept passing this amendment. Now, the Senate kept stopping it. But last week, I had the pleasure of sitting in an education committee in the House and watching, for the first time, that amendment to allow religious discrimination in Head Start be defeated in committee. There was actually applause in the committee room when the vote came down overwhelmingly in favor of not discriminating against Head Start teachers based on their religion. And by the way, the Head Start program also lifts parents out of poverty because the parents often start out as Head Start volunteers and can later become Head Start teachers. Obviously, with an amendment like the one that was being proposed, they might not get that opportunity if they were the wrong religion. The marriage amendment that keeps coming up every 2 years, coincidentally, where they want to put a theological definition of marriage on the civil contract of marriage. That may not even arise this session. If it does, I'm sure it won't be going anywhere, but then that hasn't gone anywhere in the last few sessions either. The difference in focus has to do with a misunderstanding or perhaps a purposeful rhetorical misuse of the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. These folks who wanted, if a religious organization used federal funds to administer Head Start, for example, they were claiming that free exercise of religion requires that group to hire and fire whoever they want for this federal program using federal dollars. Now, by the way, there's already an exception to employment discrimination law for money that a religious group raises on their own and they use to hire their own employees when it's not a federal program. But they were claiming free exercise means we can apply for federal grants and then ignore the rules, because part of our exercise is to only work with people we agree with on theology, or part of our free exercise, in the case of military chaplains, they were arguing, is that we have to be given the right to go overseas and proselytize soldiers who don't want to hear about our religion. Well, this was a very big issue last year, and this was a really good example of our work in a bipartisan way. Because attached to the Department of Defense spending bill last year in the House was an amendment that said military chaplains can proselytize anyone they want when they're sent to these bases. And there was no limit on when or where or how either. The Senate passed the Department of Defense spending bill but took out that amendment, didn't pass that amendment. And then it went into what's called conference committee to work out the differences. Well, the session last year, the 109th Congress, was almost over, and they were busy fighting about this amendment. And Senator Warner, who was chairing that conference committee, a Republican from Virginia, said, look, if this particular issue is really important, then we should have hearings on it and find out what it's about, not just say, well, you won't let this spending bill go through because you have to have this amendment. So we should take this amendment out, pass the spending bill, and if you want to bring it up next year, we'll have hearings on it. That was essential because, I'll tell you, one of the people that I work with on, sorry, she's a good friend of mine. She knows I don't work on her. What is an Episcopal priest who served as a military chaplain for a couple of years and happens to be a good friend of mine from Nevada. And she saw what was happening when she was over there because she felt her job was to counsel the soldiers. And she understood some of the soldiers might want theological counseling from her, and she's perfectly capable to do that, and some might not. And she was there for them, not to tout her religion on the government dime. She also understood that given the federal court decision in the 80s that said, yes, we can use federal money to pay for military chaplains because they're there for the free exercise needs of the soldiers who may be stationed far away from their churches. She understood that if this proselytizing piece went through, it could destroy the whole chaplaincy, because now it would no longer necessarily be constitutional to use the government dime to send people to go proselytize. So she helps me out a lot with getting through not just the language of the military regs on this, but also how they play out in practice. Another really good ally in our attempts to make sure that these chaplains understand they're there for the soldiers, not for their personal religious needs, is Representative Steve Israel from New York. And I mention this because Representative Israel is a religious Jew, and a lot of our allies are not atheists, But there are a lot of religious folks who understand separation of church and state and understand how important it is for them as well as for us. Now, one of the things that happens is if a bill is passed and it's clearly unconstitutional, it can go all the way through the courts. It's a very expensive process, and we can protect our rights in the courts. And sometimes that's the only way that a minority group gets to protect its rights. So one of the things that I've had to lobby quite a bit about is Congress, at least up through last year, kept trying to pass laws to say the courts can't hear certain cases. Which cases? Establishment Clause cases, cases dealing with our issues. The House again passed, but the Senate stopped it. A bill that said you can't bring to any federal court, including the U.S. Supreme Court, any lawsuit regarding recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance in public schools. Now that means they could even ignore the ruling that says you can't force Jehovah's Witnesses to recite the pledge, and really nobody could challenge them. Well, I mean, in addition to the fact that Michael Newdow's Under God and the Pledge case, which we did I'm very proud of our Friend of the Court letter we did, which is on our website, about how harsh and difficult this makes life for our students when every day in school they're told, if you don't believe we're under God, you're not a patriot. And if they don't say the words under God in certain parts of the country, they're harassed in the schoolyard and ostracized in their communities. But regardless of this, these court stripping bills keep coming up. And it was interesting in a subcommittee hearing that Senator Brownback was running, the American Legion representative actually called the ACLU the secular Taliban. That's kind of an oxymoron, but okay. And then he later referred to and others who hate America in that context. In other words, any of us who want to enforce the Establishment Clause hate America. And there was even a bill to try to make it too expensive to bring Establishment Clause cases. And when it was mentioned that, well, if you don't want defendants to have to worry about paying the costs if they really did stomp on someone's constitutional rights, then shouldn't this also apply to free exercise cases that the other side constantly brings? And this woman from Alliance Defense Fund, ADF, almost jumped out of her seat going, no, we have to be able to collect, So it's just, this double standard that they always have when they walk in. But luckily, none of those things went through. And I'm very proud that one of the members, well, I'm proud of all 8 of the members of my coalition, which are listed on the back of our brochures. But I'm especially proud recently of one of our member groups, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, for having brought Hine versus Freedom from Religion Foundation, challenging the constitutionality of the Faith-Based Initiative Office of the President and its conferences held throughout the nation, which appear to have been attempts to try to give religious organizations an advantage over non-religious groups who applied for grants from the federal government. Right now, the U.S. Supreme Court is considering whether or not taxpayers should even have the right to bring these cases. That's how dangerous it's become out there. These faith-based initiative grants, one of the things that I'm lobbying with, every now and then I lobby on my own on a number of issues, but a lot of the times I'm lobbying with a number of other groups. And that's one of the things I really love about how the Secular Coalition for America has been accepted on the Hill. Not only do Congress members and their staffs not run out screaming and lock us out when they see my business card that says Atheists, Humanists, Freethinkers, Americans across the middle, but they also, I have access. I mean, just like any other lobbyist, they know I'm going to be talking to them about a bill. I'm not going to be trying to, rant and rave about you should believe what I believe, but just talk to them about the specific bills that I work on. But also these other groups have welcomed me in their coalitions. So one of the coalitions is the Coalition Against Religious Discrimination. And in that group, that's a group that I lobbied with against Head Start discrimination. This year, the focus of that group, which has dozens of organizations, including Americans United for Separation of Church and State, ACLU, Baptist Joint Committee, the Interfaith Alliance, National Conference for Jewish Women, just dozens of groups. This year, this group is going to be working, and I'm working with them very heavily on getting oversight and accountability, at the very least, of these faith-based grants. Did any of you read a book that came out last year by David Quo called Tempting Faith? I'm not recommending the book because the whole first half is about how he became a born-again Christian and how important his religion is to him and how he became the top man in President Bush's Office of Faith-Based Initiative. However, the really interesting thing in his book is he disclosed what's happening in this office, that there are people who, allegedly, people who are deciding who gets a grant and who doesn't. And let me preface this by saying that before the year 2000, when a religious group applied for a federal grant, they were treated exactly the same way as any other grant application. So Catholic Charities, Lutheran Family Services, all of these groups got these grants, just like Boys and Girls Club, and non-religious groups got grants. And then they understood that if they wanted federal money, they couldn't discriminate based on religion and all of that. So from 2000 on, things changed. And so in this book, Quo mentions that some of the grant deciders would toss any grant application that wasn't from a specifically Christian group. So Boys and Girls Club got nothing, and Pat Robertson's Operation Blessing got millions. Then once they got the money, they didn't require them to do what most grantees have to do, which is show that that what you're using the money on is effective, show that you're using the money in an appropriate way, that you're not taking the money or whatever. So there's like virtually no oversight, no accountability. So it would be nice to get things back on an even footing where it doesn't matter if you're a religious group, a secular group, you apply the same way, you follow the same rules. The other thing that we're going to be looking at this year, the House again passed stem cell research, embryonic stem cell research bill. And by the way, there isn't a law against embryonic stem cell research, but most of the research that is done that results in major cures, and same thing for like all throughout history, polio vaccine, all kinds of things, most of it ends up coming through the National Institutes of Health. And so right now they're doing research, but they're not allowed to use the most promising materials, which are cells out of the nucleus of blastocysts, which are about 5-day-old clumps of cells that you can't see except under a microscope, from embryos that are going to be discarded that were mostly produced in fertility clinics, and there are always extras. But they can't use most of those because the president put a stop on any other than a certain line of cells. So these bills that are being passed, this was passed in both houses last year and then resulted in the president's first veto, again passed the House this year and will be voted on in the Senate in about a week after the spring recess or Easter recess. So this is it's kind of a personal issue for me, only because I was the primary caretaker in my own home of a relative who lived with Alzheimer's for over 5 years. She lived with us for 12 years, but the last 5 she had Alzheimer's. So this idea that we want to protect this cell instead of using the most promising, because there's a difference in what embryonic cells can do versus adult cells, is just really devastating to some of us. And so August and Joe, August mentioned that he went with us on some of these visits, and Joe Foley from the University of Minnesota heard my arguments to Senator Coleman's staffer about maybe changing his vote this time because we really want it to be over the amount needed for a veto. And he won't budge on that. He has an alternative bill, which would require a more expensive process, but he wants to add funding. That would also, it's kind of experimental, so it might not be as useful. But for some reason, he sees a real difference between throwing these embryos in the trash versus doing research on them. A lot of these things, like the stem cell research bill, again, we work with a lot of other groups. Usually I lobby one-on-one on this one, but we're on sign-on letters with a lot of medical organizations and university groups. There's over 500, mostly university and medical and scientific groups, on a sign-on letter that's in the congressional record that we were asked to sign on to. But now and then, the Secular Coalition for America is asked by its board to take on an issue that no one else will touch. And this year, we have taken on Religious Freedom Restoration Act and Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Now, these two bills, the first one is called RFRA, just to make things shorter, was passed in 1993, and it basically allows members of a specific religion to have different rules for how they have to behave versus anyone from any other religion or non-religious. It privileges some from that religion over everyone else. The RLUIPA one was passed in 2000 after a lot of RFRA was held unconstitutional. Now, the part of RFRA that's still constitutional is this. If a religious organization requires in its ritual the use of hallucinogenic drugs, then they're allowed to do that. This was the UDV case that came out a few years back. Before RFRA, they said, well, if there's a compelling reason not to use these drugs for everyone else, then a religious group can't. That was the peyote case in Smith. Well, here's what bothers SCA about this. It's not, we don't have any position on drug legalization. It's the fact that a woman dying of cancer, the Supreme Court said last week, she is not allowed to use medical marijuana. Now, the problem we have is this. If the compelling state interest in telling the users of the UDV in their religion isn't so great that they can't do that, why can't she use her medical marijuana? That's the problem we have, is that you have to be a member of a specific religion to have the right to do certain things that are not so terrible that we won't allow certain religious people to do them. On the RLUIPA part, it gets a lot worse. There are counties and townships all over this country fighting lawsuits because churches and other religious buildings have decided that with RLUIPA on the books, they don't have to follow zoning regulations at all. And so a church in the county of Boulder, Colorado, started their church, no discrimination against them, they were allowed to build there. They got 5 zoning variances, all of which the county said yes to. Certainly, the county had no problem with this church. Now they requested a 6th variance to double in size and double in parking spaces. Now, have any of you ever visited Boulder, Colorado? Well, I can tell you, open space is very important in their, land plan. And this was so out of whack with a legitimate land plan. But this church is saying RLUIPA, and not just this time. We get to expand as much as we feel we need to. Little county in Easton, Connecticut. It's almost all woodsy and like an artist community. Big, huge church wants to build there that isn't even aesthetically in keeping with the rest of the town. And they're claiming RLUIPA. And so these cases are coming up. Probably the most outrageous is one in Albany, New York, where at the end of a residential street, one of the townhomes is claiming they're a church, and therefore they shouldn't have to get any permits to do punk rock bands late at night with groups like Drown Retarded Children. So, and they're claiming RLUIPA. So we're trying to deal with not necessarily, at first we were going to just try to repeal these laws and go back to using the First Amendment, the Constitution, the way the courts were using it, and go back to the standards they used to use. But I was getting laughed out of offices asking for repeal. So what we're doing is we've just presented some language to some of these offices for changes which might start curtailing some of these abuses. The other thing that we work with a lot of other groups on is to try to stop these vouchers, federal money going to religious education. In Washington, D.C., there's a pilot program which the Catholic Church has been touting as saving their parochial schools, which didn't have enough money, and so your federal dollars are saving D.C.'s parochial schools. Last year, there were 2 bills that went nowhere, which we're hoping will go somewhere this year. One was called the Responsible Education About Life Act, and it required that when federal money is used for sex ed, that it be fact-based. I mean, they actually had curriculums out there that were saying women have to be subservient to men, and they were quoting Bible passages. I mean, it was really harsh. This year they changed the title to Abortion Prevention Act, and basically what it's saying is, you know, if we're going to give federal money for these programs, they should be based on facts. And so, I mean, they were telling kids condoms never work, I mean, all kinds of, yeah. So this time around maybe it'll move. Access to Legal Pharmaceuticals Act didn't go anywhere last year, saying pharmacists can't tell someone, I'm not going to fill your birth control prescription because I don't believe in birth control. So these things might have a better chance of moving now. We've covered a lot of issues over the 15 and a half months that I've been doing this, but if you look at our website, secular.org, there's, you know, we pretty much have archived all the stuff, so you can see other issues like federal funding of Boy Scouts of America while they choose to discriminate on religion. Our Friend of the Court letter regarding Under God and the Pledge is up there. And now also on secular.org are numerous ways to support our work. We have two full-time staff, me and my associate Ron Millar, and we're now hiring a part-time public relations person. And even though all of us are paid below market rate, even for a nonprofit, and to save money, I sleep around. Now, don't edit that alone on the tape. But what I've been doing, and this has worked out so well, is when I'm invited to speak in some other part of the country, you know, obviously I don't ask for an honorarium or anything, but I do ask that they cover a cheap flight, and I got a really cheap flight here. It was like just around $200 round trip. It was really good from D.C. But I also ask that one of the members of the group give me home hospitality. And August and Rachel have been so wonderful twice now in putting me up in their lovely guest room and it's just, and driving me around and all of that. So in addition to saving money, my sleeping around has also helped me to get to know so many interesting people all over the country and really have time to visit. Most of our budget comes not from our member groups, because our member groups are 501c3 tax-deductible groups that can't do a whole lot of lobbying or advocacy. That's why they're members of the Secular Coalition for America, because the fact that my group is not tax-deductible means that I can lobby 100% of the time, and I lobby as often as possible. So most of our donors are individuals who donate. I think the median is somewhere around $100 a year. So it's just people like a number of you who are sitting here, because I know we have some of our donors here. Any of you want to raise your hand and show your fellow members that you're a supporter of SCA already? Thank you, thank you. And we also have our monthly donor giving program, and I know August and Rachel are on that. So if everyone here gave $10 a month, this group's support as a group each year would be higher than most of our major donors. Our major donors are $500 to $1,000. So I would also encourage you to do the same, or whatever you can that's similar, for the Minnesota Atheists. They are putting together a building fund, and I think that's really exciting. But they also have, you know, their regular things that they have to keep up. Another thing that you can do to help support us, even if you're not doing anything financially, is to sign up for our e-alerts. And I can assure you, even though a lot of groups I know send out e-alerts 2 or 3 times a week, I will only contact you for the most part when there's a bill about to be voted on, either in a committee or on the whole floor of a certain house, with a sample email as well as a just, you know, telling you what the bill is and what the position is. And it's really easy to alert your people. And we only ask you to contact those people on that committee if that's your particular representative. So this helps us a lot, because when I walk into lobby, it really helps if they've received 200 calls from their constituents on this issue already. The other thing that really helps us a lot is something that August already mentioned, and that is if you plan on visiting D.C., and it's a great place to visit. I think it's a great place to live, but not everyone feels that way. You've got to be a political junkie to want to live there. But if you do plan on visiting D.C., call us ahead of time, and we'll try to set up some meetings where I walk in with you, and we're talking about whatever the issue is that's coming up at that point. That helps because it means a lot when I walk in with a constituent. And the fact that I've done now about 25 of these constituent visits also helps me generally have a little bit more credibility in those offices, although, as I said, I've been given very good access to date. So, the other positive that has come out of my being on the Hill is that between the time I was hired in September of 2005 and today, there's more inclusion, more access, more recognition of us. This was pretty much capped with our contest that we just finished, in which we were looking for the highest level elected official who would be willing to say publicly, I am a non-theist, meaning I don't believe in a supreme being or beings. And the highest level person we found was Representative Pete Stark from the East Bay area of California. He identifies as a non-theist who identifies as a Unitarian, or in his words, I'm a Unitarian who doesn't believe in a supreme being. And it wasn't just the Secular Coalition for America that made this possible. Local groups like yours, all of us are making a difference in terms of people learning that we are not horrible people. You know, that when someone goes into a voting booth, whether or not the person they're voting for happens to share their belief system doesn't necessarily correlate to whether or not they're going to vote the way they want on policies. I know when I was in the Nevada State Senate, a tremendous number of my votes were more in recognition, or not more in recognition, more overlapping with the values of my theistic constituents than some of the people who identified as being members of their churches. And so this idea that people should be prejudiced when they walk into a voting booth based solely on someone's religion, you know, we're starting to break that down, although surveys still show that a majority of people are. That they'll walk into a voting booth, and maybe not regarding Muslims or Jews or other minorities, but certainly regarding atheists, the majority of Americans won't vote for, according to the surveys, for a qualified non-theistic candidate. And so I think that has a lot to do with misunderstandings about the fact that, you know, we live moral, ethical lives. A lot of non-theists, atheists, humanists, freethinkers, brights, you know, whoever, are going to also, on the day of prayer, while you're doing your Day of Reason events, they're going to be giving blood, and they're going to keep track of how many non-theists donated blood that day, because certainly the fact that we don't accept that prayer is going to help somebody, we certainly still want to help somebody, so we're still going to do what we can to make that difference in our world and help our fellow man. So just getting those kinds of misconceptions, breaking them down, has made a world of difference, and that's where groups like yours really help as well. So I want to thank you so much for everything you do. Thank you for having me, and I'm going to answer questions. You're not fuzzy anymore. There we go.